Hey guys, tonight we're not talking about kings or knights or grand adventures. No, tonight's story is about what it was really like to spend just one night inside a medieval brothel. The dirty linen, the questionable ointments, the booming economy of body odour, and let's not forget the bed bugs, which, by the way, were considered the least of your worries. Now before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. Now close your eyes, lay back, because tonight you're not just learning about history, you're living it. Let's start with the basics. The term brothel might conjure some saucy ideas today, but in the medieval period, it was more like a medical experiment conducted on a hay mattress soaked in human regret. Brothels were often legal, regulated and deeply embedded into the infrastructure of European towns, especially in places like 14th century London, where entire streets were dedicated to what was politely referred to as the women's trade. But don't mistake regulation for cleanliness. Hygiene was an optional fantasy, plumbing was a whisper of the future, and privacy was just the name of a goat someone once knew. As the sun sets behind the cathedral and the gutters begin to overflow with the usual blend of rainwater and rancid stew runoff, you arrive at your destination. It's not subtle. There's no red neon light, no catchy jazz tune. Just a wooden sign with some faint anatomically suggestive carvings and a smell that hits you square in the respiratory system. It's a blend of boiled onions, stale ale, and something disturbingly close to rotting eel. You step inside and the floor is sticky. Not metaphorically sticky, literally sticky. And it's unclear whether that's from spilt drink, medieval resin used to plug drafty floorboards, or simply centuries of feet doing unholy things to untreated wood. The soundscape is a chaotic mixture of groaning beams, tin cups slamming onto rough-hewn tables, and the coughs of men who think garlic is a cure for everything. Welcome to your night's accommodation. Now here's the fun part. Brothels weren't just dens of pleasure. They were highly organised institutions, sometimes even owned by the local bishop. Yes, you heard that right. In cities like Avignon and Nuremberg, clergy not only tolerated the brothels but actively managed them. The logic? Better to keep vice contained and taxable than to let it wander into the holy streets unregulated. Church-run sin was, after all, still sin, but at least it paid rent. You're escorted to your quarters, which is really just a room with a mattress stuffed with straw and suspiciously warm in the middle. The sheets haven't been washed since the Treaty of Verdun, and you can actually see the imprint of someone's back still faintly outlined in the grime. There's a single candle in the room, but don't get excited. It's made from tallow, which means it smells like someone microwaved beef fat in a wooden bucket. You sit down and immediately regret everything. Now let's talk about protection. And by protection, we mean the medieval equivalent of a medical gamble. Condoms did exist, sort of, but they were made from linen soaked in chemicals or animal intestines tied off with ribbons. It was less safe sex and more experimental fashion statement. There were also herbal pastes and amulets worn to ward off syphilis, a disease so feared it had names like the Great Pox and was blamed on whichever country you didn't like at the time. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. The Neapolitans blamed the Spanish blamed the French, and everyone else just blamed God. Of course, no discussion of the medieval brothel would be complete without addressing the soundtrack of the experience. Not sultry harps or soothing flutes, but the constant hum of lice crawling through every available fabric. Personal hygiene was largely performative. A quick splash of rosewater, a sprig of rosemary tucked under the armpit, maybe a communal sponge if you were feeling decadent. Full body bathing? Only for the terminally wealthy or the terminally French. The workers in these establishments were often poor women, forced into the trade by economic necessity or coercion, though some worked with relative autonomy, renting space from brothel keepers and even organising informal unions. But the danger was omnipresent. The mortality rate was high, abuse was common, and diseases like gonorrhea were treated with remedies that included mercury ointments, which worked as well as you'd expect something mercury-based to work. As the candle sputters and your skin begins to itch in places you didn't know had nerves, you start to grasp just how little romance existed in this operation. Everything here is transactional. Bodily fluids, time, scraps of bread. It's all part of the economy. Even your shoes, which you've wisely kept on, are probably now considered a form of currency. And then there's the sound. Not just the rhythmic creaking from the next room, but the persistent background wheeze of someone whose lungs have declared mutiny. You realise you're breathing in air that has been filtered through centuries of chest colds and the occasional rat fume. It's easy to forget in modern times how physical spaces were once communal in the most uncomfortable way possible. Curtains were walls, a bucket was the restroom, and your bedside table was just the floor. If you were lucky, the night would pass with nothing more than a few bites from the local flea population and a sense of emotional detachment so deep it borders on spiritual. But if you were unlucky, well, let's just say the urinalysis charts of the 15th century included descriptions like milky and steaming, which is never something you want associated with your name. And yet people kept coming back, because the medieval brothel was more than a place of physical exchange. It was where social lines blurred. Nobles and peasants, merchants and mercenaries, all found themselves equally undignified under those lice-ridden sheets. It was where power played out in whispers and moans, where transactions became confessions, and where a deeply unequal society somehow managed to equalize everyone through a shared exposure to body odor and regret. So as the night drags on, and you try not to touch the walls, the sheets, or your own face, remember this: you're not surviving this brothel, you're enduring it. With every breath, you're inhaling the full complexity of medieval vice, and possibly several spores. Now, the morning light is still hours away and you haven't even made it to breakfast yet. But don't worry, that's a whole other nightmare. The mattress underneath you hasn't softened overnight. In fact, it seems to have developed a personality. A mean one. Every time you shift your weight, it responds with a sharp reminder that straw does not age like fine wine. And yet, as you lie there, refusing to breathe through your nose, it occurs to you that the physical discomfort might be the least offensive part of the whole experience. Your real trouble begins once you realise what you may have just walked away with. The medieval brothel wasn't just a place of pleasure, it was a petri dish with a drink menu. The odds of leaving with a souvenir were alarmingly high, and we're not talking about trinkets or fond memories. No, you're far more likely to leave with something that makes your skin peel off in protest, or your organs throw in the towel entirely. Medieval sexually transmitted diseases were the stuff of legends and denial, not because they were rare, but because medicine hadn't caught up to reality. The term germ wouldn't exist for centuries, and theories of disease centered around imbalances in the four humours, planetary misalignment, and the occasional divine punishment for impure thoughts. If you found yourself oozing from places that were never supposed to ooze, the local apothecary would likely prescribe a blend of crushed herbs, animal bile, and prayer. A lot of prayer. Syphilis was the showstopper. When it erupted across Europe in the late 15th century, it was nicknamed the Great Pox, and unlike its more glamorous cousin the smallpox, syphilis had a flair for the dramatic. It began with painful sores, then moved on to grotesque ulcers, neurological damage, and in some cases facial collapse. Entire sections of your face could fall off. But because the disease could take weeks or even years to fully blossom, most people didn't realise they were infected until they were already halfway to being a walking cautionary tale. Doctors didn't have antibiotics, of course. What they did have was mercury. Yes, the same substance we now use to explain why you shouldn't lick old thermometers. Mercury was applied in ointments, swallowed in small doses, or even used in steam baths to try to sweat out the disease. One common treatment was to rub mercury into open wounds. The idea was that the poison would poison whatever else was poisoning you. In practice, this usually just poisoned you. The brothel itself rarely bore the blame. If anything, it was considered a vital pressure release valve for society. Authorities believed that men denied access to commercial sex were more likely to commit crimes, or worse, fall in love with someone else's wife. Brothels were often located near city gates, rivers, or churchyards, where travellers and pilgrims were more likely to pass through. In some towns, municipal funds were even used to help maintain the brothels. After all, what better way to keep the peace than to legalise the chaos? But while city officials debated the morality of taxation versus damnation, the women inside the brothel faced a very different kind of suffering. They were the first to feel the symptoms, the last to receive treatment, and almost never in control of what happened to their own bodies. Many worked under brothel keepers who charged rent, deducted fees for candles, linens and food, and ensured that the women ended each night in more debt than they began, a form of economic imprisonment that wrapped itself in the illusion of choice. And yet, even with this backdrop of suffering, superstition found a way to dance through the infected air like a drunken minstrel. It was commonly believed that diseases could be transferred through imbalanced bodily vapours. One particularly delightful theory was that sleeping with a virgin could cleanse a man of venereal disease. This resulted in a horrific ripple effect, where even younger girls were exploited under the guise of curing someone's infected conscience. The link between sanitation and disease was, unsurprisingly, lost on most people. Washing your hands was seen as suspiciously fussy, and bathing was only encouraged in moderation, lest it open the pores too much and let the bad air in. Some believed that wearing garlic around the neck could ward off infection. Others swore by charms, bloodletting, or drinking wine mixed with dried toad powder. In this setting, developing a rash wasn't a sign of infection. It was a social icebreaker. For those who sought treatment, options included the ever-popular leech therapy, which involved applying leeches to sensitive areas in hopes of sucking out the imbalance. There was also cauterization, where red-hot irons were applied to visible sores. This often solved the problem by creating a larger problem in the same general area. Medical texts of the period recommended things like crushed emeralds, ox bile, and white lead as topical treatments. Because nothing says recovery like smearing yourself with poisonous minerals and hoping for the best. Records from cities like Paris and Bologna show that local governments kept track of brothel activities with bureaucratic enthusiasm. Registries listed the names of the workers, their earnings, and even their health status. Women suspected of carrying disease were sometimes forced to undergo humiliating examinations, or be quarantined in hospitals that were little more than holding pens. These institutions were ironically named houses of correction, as if syphilis were the result of bad manners. The social stigma, of course, didn't help. Men who contracted diseases often blamed the women. Women who showed symptoms were labelled impure, unholy, or simply disposable. And because most infections spread quietly at first, many simply ignored the problem until their noses collapsed, their hair fell out, or their joints refused to bend without issuing a noise that sounded like a church door slamming in slow motion. Even religious orders weren't immune. In some monasteries, monks were found frequenting local brothels, leading to some awkward confessions and even more awkward punishments. The line between sin and salvation was thin, and usually drawn in chalk on a wooden floor that hadn't been scrubbed in 3 centuries. Repentance could be purchased through donation, penance, or just staying sick quietly enough to not embarrass anyone important. You lie there in that itchy bed, increasingly aware that every square inch of your skin is touching something that may have a name. You think about the people who came before you, not metaphorically, but literally. The men who sweated and sighed and left behind traces of themselves in ways that would make a modern forensic lab break out into a cold sweat. The physical history of the brothel clings to every surface like a damp rag of regret. And then it dawns on you that even if you manage to escape this place without any physical symptoms, you're still going to carry the psychological ones. The paranoia, the scratching, the deep sense of betrayal that your own era of medicine has let you time travel without antibiotics. Because you're not just lying in a medieval brothel, you're marinating in centuries of untreated symptoms and hopelessly optimistic beliefs about the healing power of goat urine. And just when you think things couldn't get worse, you hear it. A scratching at the door, not from a rat or another patron, but from something even more medieval. Regulation. Because brothels weren't just disease vectors, they were tax centres, and you're about to meet the man whose job it is to make sure the city gets its cut of every cough, groan, and suspicious ointment sold inside these walls. And no, he doesn't knock. The door opens without ceremony. In steps a man whose profession should, by all logic, require silence, discretion, and some understanding of personal hygiene. Instead, he enters like a pig that learned to walk upright, dragging the scent of fermented cabbage, wet wool, and old tax scrolls behind him like a cursed aura. You've just met the brothel inspector, or rather, the local authority figure tasked with making sure your night of dubious decisions contributes to the city's economic well-being. Brothel regulation in the medieval period was not only common, it was profitable. In many towns, prostitution was legal, taxed, and administered with the same level of bureaucratic obsession you might associate with a toll booth or a cheese guild. Municipal brothels, especially in places like London's Southwark district or Avignon in southern France, were officially sanctioned and monitored to ensure the city extracted every possible groat from groin-based commerce. Your inspector carries a ledger. It's been wet, probably with ale, and it crackles ominously when opened. This book contains the names of every worker, the number of clients serviced, and in some cases, helpful, marginal notes like coughing again, or still missing a tooth. It's an odd blend of accountancy and voyeurism, conducted under the very real belief that civic order required moral compromise, preferably one that could be itemised and filed. The irony, of course, is that brothels were often located within a stone's throw of cathedrals, and in some cases directly owned by religious institutions. In Avignon, the papal court turned a blind eye, or depending on the Treasury report, both eyes, to the bustling sex trade that operated in its backyard. The logic was familiar: regulate vice to contain it, control the money flow, and ensure that sin remained taxable, if not entirely preventable. Inspections weren't always about bookkeeping. Sometimes they included health checks, although health, in medieval terms, was defined less by symptoms and more by astrological alignment and the colour of your urine. Inspectors might look for signs of visible disease or, failing that, simply sniff the sheets and call it a day. There were no microscopes, no diagnostic tests, just the inspector's nose and a deeply misplaced confidence in his ability to detect corruption by scent alone. The women working here were required to pay fees not just to the brothel keeper, but to the city itself. These taxes went by many names: the lecher's rent, the tolerance fee, the sin penny. In some cities, workers were even required to wear distinctive clothing, such as striped hoods or bells to mark their profession. It wasn't so much about shaming them as it was about advertising them as part of the urban economy, like a walking menu with syphilitic footnotes. You watch as the inspector walks from room to room, scribbling notes with the flair of someone who once dreamed of being a monk, but got distracted by gossip and mildew. He checks the number of candles burned, the state of the chamber pots, and the apparent functionality of the bedding, which, in this case, seems to involve poking it with a stick and hoping it doesn't scream. When he glances at you, there's no judgment, just a calculation. Another body in the tally, another coin in the coffer. And he's not alone in this economy of flesh. In fact, entire guilds were built around managing the infrastructure that supported brothels. Bakers provided food for workers, laundresses washed, or attempted to wash, the linens. Physicians treated injuries and infections with a rotating cast of herbal pastes and deeply speculative procedures. Blacksmiths repaired locks and hinges, while midwives often doubled as discreet attendants for unwanted pregnancies or late-night emergency leechings. The brothel was a business, and like any business, it required order, oversight, and a depressingly robust tolerance for moral ambiguity. Some cities issued licenses to workers, others created zones where prostitution was allowed, while banning it from more respectable districts, as if a street name could prevent venereal spread. In 15th century Nuremberg, brothels were so tightly controlled that any deviation from the rules, unauthorized workers, under-the-table payments, improper attire, could result in fines or forced closures. But for all the paperwork and regulation, corruption thrived. Inspectors were often bribed to overlook infractions, and many kept lists of favoured establishments, where the beds were slightly less hostile to human survival. In some cases, the inspectors themselves were former clergy or ex-soldiers, men who had seen too much, smelled too much, and decided that counting bodies in a ledger was marginally safer than collecting them off a battlefield. As you lie there under a blanket that feels like it's been used to mop a stable, the reality of your situation sinks in deeper. You're not in a den of sin. You're in a civic utility, like a sewer or a tannery, something unpleasant but necessary. Something that smells terrible, but keeps the rest of society marginally more stable. And like all medieval institutions, it operates under the illusion of structure, while quietly praying that no one sneezes hard enough to bring the whole thing down. Your host, the brothel keeper, is likely paying several levels of rent, one to the building's owner, one to the city, and another in bribes to ensure the inspectors stay friendly. This is not a thriving business. It's a desperate balancing act where one slow week or one outbreak of infection could bankrupt the entire operation. And yet the place persists, fueled by demand, desperation, and the quiet understanding that nobody wants to talk about what happens behind those stained wooden doors, but everyone wants the doors to stay open. Even the furniture has an economic function. Beds are often shared across shifts, with one set of workers finishing just as the next begins. Blankets are rotated with such frequency that it's unclear whether they belong to anyone or simply exist in a permanent state of damp neutrality. Stools double as wash basins, buckets triple as toilets, stools, and sometimes dinner tables, depending on the night's events and the general flexibility of your standards. Some brothels offered menus of services. These were rarely written down, of course, since literacy was not high among clientele or staff, but they were communicated through hand gestures, pricing systems, or the occasional symbolic carving on a wall. A rooster meant something, a pear, something else. A boot with no laces, you don't want to know. And then there's the coinage itself. Payment was often made in clipped silver, tokens, or IOUs. Some brothels issued their own tokens, which could be redeemed for services or drinks. These tokens have been found in archaeological digs, often engraved with suggestive images, indicating a level of branding sophistication that would make a modern marketing agency weep. Your inspector finally departs, leaving behind a faint trail of grease and ink. You can still smell him, a reminder that even in places where bodies are currency, bureaucracy never sleeps. The air returns to its baseline of sweat and wood rot. You try to settle back into your bed, knowing full well that the night is not over, not even close, because just outside your paper-thin wall someone has begun to sing, loudly, off-key, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of a lute being used as a weapon, and as the singing grows louder, and the sound of arguing spills into the hallway. You remember one more crucial fact about medieval brothels. They never closed. Someone is trying to sing. You can't tell if it's in Latin or just the sound of a man gargling beer through a missing front tooth. Either way, the melody is consistent only in its aggression. Outside your room, the raucous symphony of a fully operational medieval brothel reaches new levels of cacophony, punctuated by shouting, retching, and something that sounds suspiciously like a chicken being chased by a drunk with a lute. The reason? Ale. The brothel's atmosphere is not fueled by passion or romance. It's powered almost entirely by alcohol, served in crude wooden mugs and consumed with the kind of desperation normally reserved for battlefield surgery. And in this particular brothel, as in most, the house drink is not just a beverage, it's a strategic tool. The more they drink, the more they spend. The more they spend, the less they remember, and the less they remember, the fewer questions they ask about the nature of the crust forming on their straw mattress. Medieval ale was not brewed for enjoyment, it was brewed because water was frequently lethal. Rivers and wells, especially in cities, were filled with human waste, animal waste, rotting food, decaying corpses, and on occasion, an entire missing fisherman. Beer and ale were safer because the boiling process killed most pathogens. So if you didn't want your intestines to turn on you in the middle of the night, you drank ale. Morning, noon, and night. But brothel ale? That was a special category. It was often watered down, stretched out with bread crusts, flavoured with questionable herbs, or brewed in a way that made it taste like liquid shoe. Quality was not the priority. Profit was. And so the average brothel drink might come with hints of old socks, regret, and a faint whisper of rosemary if someone had dropped a roast into the fermentation barrel last week. The alcohol content varied wildly. Some drinks were strong enough to make your vision stutter. Others were so weak they barely qualified as bread soup. But none of that mattered. In a brothel, ale was currency, anesthesia, and aphrodisiac all in one. Patrons drank to loosen their tongues, dull their senses, and convince themselves that the person before them looked less like a toothless peasant and more like a noble's daughter on a rebellious streak. Brothel keepers understood this well. Many employed their own brewers or struck deals with nearby taverns to supply the house with just enough rock gut to keep things lively. Some establishments even forced their workers to push drinks, earning a cut of the profits from every mug sold. A slow night could be salvaged with enough ale. A rough customer could be soothed, seduced, or strategically rendered unconscious before he broke a chair over someone's head. And with ale came trouble. The rowdiness wasn't a side effect. It was the main event. Fights were constant. Brawls broke out over women, over money, over who knocked over whose candle. Ale inspired bravery in fools and foolishness in everyone else. A man might arrive with coins and good intentions, only to end the evening wearing his own shoe as a hat and trying to explain to the watchman why he was naked in a barrel outside. Local authorities tolerated this to a point, but even the most indulgent constable had limits. Noise ordinances existed, though they were rarely enforced unless someone important complained. More often, guards were paid to look the other way, or were personally inside enjoying their own ale-soaked visit. And if violence escalated too far, say to the point of an accidental stabbing with a butter knife, the brothel keeper would be expected to handle it discreetly, ideally before dawn, and preferably without alerting the parish priest. Alcohol wasn't just for patrons. Workers drank too, though not always by choice. In some brothels, drinking was part of the job. It helped dull the mental toll of the work, masked hunger, and took the edge off chronic infections. But it also led to addiction, liver failure, and the kind of memory loss that made time blur into one long slurred conversation with no beginning and no end. Certain brothels specialised in their own brews. Some were known for extra potent ales, others for spiced wine or warmed mead served in chipped ceramic mugs. In port towns, rum might enter the equation. In colder climates, mulled wine laced with cloves, honey, and the occasional questionable root was served to give the illusion of luxury. But no matter the drink, it was rarely clean. Wooden cups were rinsed, if at all, with rainwater or the contents of a nearby bucket. You can guess what else went into that bucket. And then there were the drinking games. Medieval revellers invented countless ways to make public inebriation even more dangerous. There was the ever-popular who can drink the fastest, followed closely by who can walk in a straight line after doing so, and finally, who can still sing after vomiting into the fire pit. Brothels encouraged these activities because they kept customers from realizing that their purse strings had been replaced with empty string. Sometimes ale was used medicinally, not effectively mind you, but enthusiastically. Hot ale mixed with herbs was considered a cure for everything from chills to impotence. If you had a sore throat, you drank ale. If you had a broken toe, you drank more ale. If your skin was turning green and your nose had fallen off, someone would likely offer you ale with a knowing nod, as if this potion held the answer to centuries of poor sanitation and systemic disease. The room you're lying in still reeks of it. Not just the drink, but the bodies that consumed it. Ale oozes from the walls, the breath, the pores of the man still snoring down the hall like a wheezing bellows. It's in the mattress soaked deep into the straw. It's in the air thick enough to chew. And the worst part is, you're beginning to crave it too. Because in this place, ale is survival. Not because it makes anything better, but because it makes you forget. Forget the smell. Forget the sores. Forget the fact that you're essentially lying in a tavern, inside a bedroom, inside a city that smells like burning dung and rotting onions. Forget that this entire economy is held together by yeast and denial. You're not sober anymore. You're not awake either. You're just floating in that special in-between state unique to medieval intoxication, where time bends, morals loosen, and the sound of a goat walking down the hall no longer surprises you. Somewhere nearby, someone begins retching into a basin, or possibly a boot. It's impossible to tell. You roll over and try not to think about your liver, and just when it seems the chaos might quiet down, the door opens again. Not yours, the one leading to the brothel's most sacred room, the bath chamber, if one can even call it that. Because where there is ale, there must eventually be washing. And where there is medieval washing, there is always trouble. The door creaks open, and something resembling steam slithers out into the corridor. Not the clean, mineral-scented kind you might associate with modern spas, but a damp fog that smells like boiled cabbage, mildew, and wet dog. You've stumbled upon the brothel's bathing room, or as it was generously called in this establishment, the cleansing chamber. Though to be perfectly clear, nothing here is particularly clean. Not the water, not the tools, and certainly not the intentions. Medieval hygiene operated on a rotating wheel of misunderstanding, denial, and superstition. The average person believed that excessive washing could open the pores and let bad air, or miasma, seep into the body, causing everything from fevers to spontaneous guilt. Bathing was tolerated, even encouraged in moderation, but too much cleanliness was suspicious. In some circles, it was downright heretical. After all, if God had wanted you to smell like rose water, he would have filled your nose with flowers. Yet despite this cultural aversion, brothels were one of the few places where a form of ritual washing was expected. Patrons wanted at least the illusion of hygiene, and workers needed some way to remove the day's accumulated grime before starting again. But this wasn't a luxurious soak in scented oils and clean linens. This was damage control. The centerpiece of the bath chamber is a wooden tub roughly the size and shape of a beer barrel that gave up on its career. It's darkened with age, water stains, and several substances you're better off not identifying. The water inside is warm, not because it's been boiled fresh, but because it has been used repeatedly and is now hosting its own ecosystem. Occasionally someone heats a pot of water over a fire and dumps it in to freshen the mix, which is the bathing equivalent of spraying perfume on a rotting herring. Soap is available, though in medieval terms that's an ambitious label. Most of it is made from rendered animal fat mixed with ash or lye, which leaves a residue that makes your skin feel waxed, scorched, or both. Some brothels go the extra mile and add herbs, rosemary, lavender, or mint, but only if they're near a monastery garden and the monks are feeling generous or asleep. The scrubbing tool of choice is a communal sponge tied to a stick. It is not replaced regularly. It is passed around with the same reverence you might reserve for a family heirloom, one that's been dropped in a privy multiple times and still returned to the mantle with pride. The sponge is used on everyone, in every area, and rinsed only when someone drops it, screams, and decides it's time for a reset. Bath attendants are sometimes hired to help with the process. Their job is to refill water, scrape dirt, and occasionally beat the tub with a ladle when it starts to attract flies. They're paid poorly, often in food, and suffer a professional lifespan shorter than most mayflies. The combination of hot air, strong odours, and clientele in various states of inebriation turns the bathhouse into a sort of open-air fever dream. But it's also where business deals are made, songs are sung, and disputes over bread crusts are settled through splashing. The brothel's workers use the bath chamber strategically. A quick dip before meeting a client, a rinse between visits, a desperate scrub at the end of the night when the smell becomes strong enough to startle livestock outside. But they are not bathing out of luxury. They're trying to keep infections at bay with limited means and fading optimism. Diseases like scabies, lice, and trench fever lurk in the folds of unwashed linens and in the very boards of the tub itself. No amount of rosemary can compete with that. Some brothels enforce a washing fee, a small extra charge that gives the illusion that hygiene is part of the service. Others advertise the use of pure water brought from nearby springs, which in reality comes from the same source as the horse trough out back. One particularly bold establishment in northern Italy claimed to have imported its bath salts from Byzantium. These turned out to be ground-up bricks. Medical texts of the era recommended various bathing regimens, especially for those engaged in sexual activity. Physicians believed that warm water could rebalance the humours, especially when mixed with crushed herbs, rose petals, or bits of deer antler. Unfortunately, most of these recipes required ingredients that cost more than the combined weekly earnings of every person in the brothel, so substitutions were made. Nettle instead of lavender, onion peel instead of sage, vinegar in place of wine, and occasionally just prayer. The bathwater itself was not changed between clients. It was filtered, if you could call it that, by skimming the top layer with a bucket and then swirling it around to redistribute the cleanliness. Hair floated freely, so did other things, and yet somehow this still felt preferable to staying dirty, because even in the filth, even in the floating debris and questionable soap, there was a moment, however brief, of warmth. That warmth is what you're feeling now as you stand at the doorway, watching someone dunk their head and emerge triumphantly with a ragged sigh. It smells awful, yes, but it also cuts through the layers of stink and despair clinging to your own skin. You consider stepping in, not because you think it'll help, but because it might temporarily convince your brain that you're not entirely made of dust and ale residue. You remove your shirt, which immediately folds in on itself like it's trying to escape. You step into the tub. It is warmer than expected, softer somehow. You realise too late that this is not due to comfort but the sediment at the bottom. You stop moving. If you don't disturb the water, you tell yourself, it's just a warm soup of good intentions. Someone nearby offers you a bar of soap that smells like scorched ham and burns slightly upon contact. You nod in gratitude, you scrub, you rinse, You avoid eye contact with the sponge, and for a brief moment, you almost feel human again. Then someone vomits into the corner bucket and the illusion vanishes. There is no privacy in the brothel bath, no separation of space. Everyone is equal in this tub regardless of rank or stink, and perhaps that's the most democratic part of the whole establishment. Here, under the candle smoke and flickering torchlight, you're not a client. You're not a worker. You're just another body trying not to touch anything with your mouth open. Outside, the sounds of evening begin again. Footsteps, laughter, the rhythmic thud of someone falling down the stairs on purpose. You rise from the tub like a stewed turnip, wrap yourself in a towel that was last washed during the 100 Years' War, and limp back to your room, cleaner in body but not in conscience. Your skin itches, but now for different reasons. You lie back on the straw, freshly steamed, and try to pretend it feels better. But just as your eyes begin to close, you hear it again. A knock. This time from someone far more dangerous than the inspector, the local healer. Because in medieval brothels, hygiene was just the beginning. The real trouble came with the treatments. You sit up in your straw-soaked bed, still damp from your regrettable bath, and the knock on the wall echoes again. Not a friendly knock, not even a polite one. It's the kind of knock that suggests someone on the other side carries a pouch full of vials and absolutely no qualifications. The brothel's healer has arrived. Or rather, the person who claims to be a healer. In the medieval brothel, medical care was less a profession and more a series of experiments performed on consenting and non-consenting bodies, using whatever happened to be within arm's reach. The healers who serviced these establishments were not typically trained doctors. They were herbalists, wandering apothecaries, midwives with aggressive side hustles, or occasionally a barber who got bored of cutting hair and started cutting other things instead. Your door opens with that familiar creak, and in steps someone who looks like they've just crawled out of a herbal grave. Their cloak is stained with mysterious fluids. They carry a sack that jingles ominously, and their hands are permanently tinted a shade of greenish brown that suggests they have been handling substances that scream upon contact with air. They ask if anyone in the room is suffering from swelling, burning, itching, or a sensation best described as spiritual rot. You're about to say no when they pull out a jar filled with leeches. Now it's a yes, apparently. Leeches were among the most popular medical tools of the time. Practitioners believed that most ailments were caused by imbalances in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had too much blood, which was suspiciously often, you had to let it out. Enter the leeches. They were applied to all areas of the body, including the particularly personal regions favoured by brothel clients, where they would latch on and remove both blood and dignity simultaneously. Other treatments included the application of garlic paste, which was thought to have purifying effects. Crushed garlic, sometimes mixed with wine or goose fat, would be applied directly to sores, rashes, or any area showing signs of medieval displeasure. The smell alone was enough to ward off small animals and large suitors. Whether it helped medically was entirely up to the placebo gods. And then there was mercury. Sweet, poisonous, widely used mercury. Found in ointments, pastes, and suppositories, mercury was a favoured ingredient for treating the pox, syphilis, gonorrhea, and anything else that caused swelling in places where swelling should not occur. It was believed that sweating out the poison would cure you. In practice, sweating out your teeth was more likely. Mercury treatments led to tremors, hallucinations, and premature death. But it did give your skin a lovely glow right before it fell off. Healers carried with them a variety of tools that would make a modern surgeon weep. Bone scrapers, pus spoons, iron rods for cauterizing, and jars of crushed insects mixed with vinegar. There was one mixture in particular known as theriac, a blend of dozens of ingredients including opium, viper flesh, and ground up jewels. It was marketed as a cure-all, but mainly served to make people high enough that they forgot what they were being treated for. You're handed a cup of something that smells like if someone boiled down every regret you've ever had. It is warm, viscous, and tastes like licorice had an existential crisis. You drink it because refusing a medieval healer's concoction was considered a challenge to their honour, and no one in this room needs another reason to get stabbed with a hot poker. Women working in the brothel were frequent recipients of these remedies. Some sought out treatments to manage infections, others for pain relief, and many were simply forced to comply under threat of losing their place in the house. There were remedies to delay menstruation, to induce abortion, and to mask the outward signs of venereal disease. Most of them involved plants with names like deadly nightshade or blister root, which were about as subtle as their effects. There were also fumigations. These involved sitting over a steaming pot of herbs in an enclosed chamber, while vapours attempted to cleanse the body from below. In theory, it was a spa treatment. In practice, it was a hotbox of desperation. If you inhaled enough of the fumes, you either sweated out your infection or passed out and had a vision of St. Anthony judging your life choices. In some brothels, the healer doubled as the local dentist. Toothaches were treated by yanking the tooth out with pliers or a fishhook. There were no anaesthetics apart from ale, screaming, or the occasional prayer to a saint of questionable credentials. Bleeding was encouraged, both as a treatment and as a proof that something had happened. If you survived, the healer was praised. If you didn't, it was chalked up to humoral imbalance, and you were buried behind the tavern with a coin in your mouth and a leech on your chest. Tools were rarely cleaned between uses. A cauterizing iron might go from one person's boil to another's gum line without pause. Cloth bandages were reused until they physically dissolved. Needles, if available, were shared like family heirlooms. There was no sterilization, only superstition. Incantations were muttered, prayers were offered, and if things went very badly, a curse might be blamed. You lie back as the healer waves a dried fish over your stomach and declares that your spleen is misbehaving. This diagnosis is followed by a sudden slap of warm goat butter on your chest and a vigorous chant in a dialect that might be Latin, or possibly just a drunken version of it. The healer then collects their payment in the form of bread crusts and a spoonful of grease, tucks their tools into their cloak, and vanishes back into the corridor like a damp phantom. You're now slightly stickier, significantly more confused, and potentially full of mercury. The candle by your bedside flickers, reacting either to the draught or the sheer audacity of what has just occurred. You close your eyes and try to count your remaining teeth, but lose track somewhere around your molars because your tongue has gone numb. And as your limbs grow heavy and your skin begins to tingle, not in a good way, you hear a low rhythmic thump outside your door. Not footsteps, drums. Tonight is festival night, and when festivals meet brothels, the result is never peace and quiet. It's costumed nobles, masked misbehaviour, and a night of revelry that makes everything you've endured so far feel like the opening act. The drums echo through the alley like someone's pounding on your skull with a leg of mutton. Low, steady, and unmistakably festive. You recognise the sound for what it is, a procession. The kind that involves masks, wine, and a sudden collapse of whatever thin rules were still hanging on inside this brothel. It's festival night, and the nobles are coming. Not just any nobles, but the powdered, perfumed, performatively dignified kind. The ones who spend their days barking Latin at scribes and their nights sniffing ambergris from gold flasks. Normally they would never be caught dead near a brothel, at least not officially. But festivals change the rules. When the feast days hit, especially those tied to saints who conveniently had very little to say about chastity, even the pious found themselves face first in roasted goose and moral flexibility. Tonight is one of those nights. Somewhere between a holy day and a civic riot, This festival has spilled into every corner of the town, dragging behind it dancers, musicians, pickpockets, and several men in goat masks who may or may not be clergy. The brothel responds accordingly. Torches are lit, tapestries unrolled, and the good straw is laid down, or at least the slightly less mouldy straw. Workers scramble to change into their finest linen shifts, which means fewer holes and stains in places that matter. Bowls of stale apples are scattered around as decor. The pig is moved out of the hallway, and just like that, the building transforms from a den of transactional exhaustion into something masquerading as decadence. The nobles arrive masked, because that's what makes it fun. Identity is suspended, rank becomes fluid. That man in the fox mask could be a baron, could also be someone who just stole the baron's cloak. It doesn't matter. The point is that everyone is pretending not to know each other, while very obviously knowing exactly who everyone is. Masquerade culture was common in the later medieval period, especially in urban centres where anonymity allowed for more outrageous behaviour. The masks themselves range from delicate painted papier-mâché to hastily cut leather scraps tied with wine-soaked string. Some represented animals, others depicted saints, devils, or exaggerated caricatures of townsfolk. One particularly unsettling trend involved wearing masks of one's own face, a tradition that made everyone look like their twin had died and come back angrier. Inside the brothel, the atmosphere shifts from grim routine to theatrical debauchery. Minstrels are hired to play hurdy-gurdies and broken lutes. Food is laid out, most of it questionably warm. Spiced wine flows freely, ladled from a cauldron that previously held laundry. Saffron and cinnamon are sprinkled everywhere to mask the ever-present stench of damp wool and philosophical despair. The nobles bring with them a very different flavour of chaos. They demand entertainment, novelty, and a constant supply of attention. They do not want the usual. They want a performance, and so the brothel bends to accommodate them, transforming itself into a stage where class lines blur and the rules of dignity are tossed into the same bucket as the spoiled honey cakes. Some nobles bring their own performers, jugglers, jesters, or trained monkeys wearing human shoes. One man arrives with a goose under one arm and insists it be treated with the same respect as any paying guest. It gets its own room. In this environment, the workers are no longer just workers. They're actors, forced to pretend that everything is delightful and nothing smells like foot. They laugh at jokes that barely qualify as language. They pour wine into goblets shaped like lions. They sit through speeches about falconry, warfare, and gout, nodding politely while their eyes silently calculate how much they'll need to scrub later. Festival nights were common in medieval brothels, particularly during major feasts or civic celebrations. Records from cities like Bruges and Florence describe lavish parties thrown in brothels by guild members, nobles, and visiting dignitaries. These nights often included drinking contests, erotic poetry recitations, and games that involved throwing things at each other for sport. It was considered a kind of pressure release valve for the upper classes, a chance to behave badly and then go back to pretending they had never behaved at all. Sometimes brothels were even sponsored for these occasions. Wealthy patrons would pay in advance to reserve the space, guaranteeing that the building would be filled with music, candlelight, and at least one man passed out in a bowl of pears. The owners obliged because the money was good, and the regulars didn't complain, as long as they weren't accidentally mistaken for hired entertainment. You, meanwhile, are attempting to blend in. A noble hands you a cup of wine and begins explaining the political situation in Hungary, using only hand gestures and periodic shouting. Another invites you to join a game of Guess the Spice, which involves sniffing powders while blindfolded and hoping none of them are powdered eel bladder. Every corner of the brothel is now alive with movement. Upstairs, someone is attempting to dance on a table. Downstairs, someone is attempting to retrieve their trousers from a chandelier. In the hallway, a man is serenading a mop. The mood is somewhere between religious ecstasy and poorly organised theatre. And then there's the matter of payment. Nobles, for all their wealth, were notoriously bad at paying their debts. They would run up enormous tabs, then claim diplomatic immunity, divine right, or simple forgetfulness. Brothel keepers had few options. Confront a noble and risk losing your license. Let it slide and eat the loss. Some resorted to sending anonymous notes to the noble steward the next morning, often in the form of poorly drawn sketches of the previous night's activities labelled with aggressive arrows. To hedge against this, many brothels demanded prepayment during festival nights, or they assigned a minder to each noble, someone tasked with keeping them from burning the curtains or marrying a goat. These minders were usually the oldest workers, the ones who had seen everything and now only raised an eyebrow when confronted with a man wearing antlers and reciting Virgil. You retreat to a quieter room, if such a thing exists in this building, and sit on a stool that is either wet with wine or simply wet. The sound of revelry continues. It's a joyous kind of madness, the kind that only exists when people are pretending to forget the world outside. But beneath the laughter, you see the tension, the tight smiles, the eyes that flick toward the coins, the unspoken understanding that once the masks come off, everything reverts back to normal. And then the sun begins to rise. Slowly, shame creeps in like a tax collector. Masks are removed, hair is straightened, clothes are tugged back into something resembling order. Nobles tiptoe out with wine stains on their cuffs, and a profound inability to make eye contact. The brothel falls quiet. Not silent, but quieter. The illusion is over. But the real work is just beginning. Because while nobles leave with stories, the brothel is left with broken chairs, unpaid bills, and a mop that now needs to be exercised. And you, still unwashed and smelling faintly of goose, must now face the day, which begins with breakfast, if you can call it that. The nobles have gone. The masks are gone. The torches have burned out or been stolen. The brothel lies in a state of hungover stillness, like a battlefield where the only casualties were dignity and cutlery. You lie on your mattress trying to remember if you've eaten anything in the last 12 hours that wasn't served in liquid form or scraped off a shared surface. Then you hear it. A clang, a clatter, a slosh. The unmistakable sound of breakfast, or something pretending to be breakfast. In a medieval brothel, the morning meal was less about nourishment and more about survival. You ate whatever was left over from the night before, repurposed, reheated, or simply rebranded. There were no menus, there were no choices, there were only bowls, smells, and the quiet understanding that anything warm was probably safer than anything cold. The cook is already at work. She's been up for hours, possibly days. She stirs a cauldron with a spoon that also functions as a paddle. The contents are a mystery. A stew of bread ends, vegetable peels, bones that may or may not be pig, and the occasional beetle that failed to escape the prep table in time. This is the house porridge, or slop, or morning mash, depending on who you ask and how many teeth they still have. You're handed a bowl. It is wooden, it is cracked, it leaks slightly. You hold it carefully and dip in your spoon. It resists, not like a solid, not like a liquid, like a memory, something that once dreamed of being food, but has long since accepted its place in the digestive hierarchy. You taste it. It is warm. It is slightly sweet. It is mostly bland. Occasionally there's a burst of something unexpected. A raisin, a peppercorn, a tiny fish. These are the surprises that keep you awake. Bread is offered. It is not fresh. It is hard enough to be considered weaponized. You dunk it in the mash and it softens slightly. You chew, slowly, carefully. Medieval bread was made with a variety of flours depending on region and class. Rye, barley, peas, beans. sometimes mixed with chalk or clay to stretch the batch. In brothels, the bread came from wherever was cheapest. Often it was black bread, dense, bitter, filling in the way that a doorstop is filling. Meat is rare in the morning. If it appears at all, it is boiled until grey. Often bone is included to add flavour, or because separating the two is too much trouble. Fat is prized, skin is consumed, nothing is wasted. Not because of culinary pride, but because hunger has no dignity. Sometimes eggs are served. These come from chickens that live in the alley and dine exclusively on dropped sausage and philosophical despair. The eggs are usually boiled, sometimes fried in grease, occasionally scrambled with herbs. If you're very unlucky, they are raw and slipped into your cup of wine as a cure for whatever it is you now carry. Dairy is unpredictable. Cheese may appear, it may also disappear while you're looking at it. Medieval cheese came in two varieties, hard and harder. It was stored in cloth or wax. It smelled like wet hay. It was consumed with bread or dissolved into stew. Milk was avoided unless you were a child, a monk, or very desperate. Butter was rare and often rancid by dawn. Drinks are limited. Ale, always ale. Thin, warm, flat. Occasionally sour. Brewed in the same barrels used to rinse the linens. Water is not an option. Not unless you enjoy the thrill of rolling intestinal dice. The room you eat in is called the dining hall. It is also the main room, the lounge, the waiting area, the goat room. It has one table, two benches, several stools that scream when sat upon. A cat watches you from the rafters. Its expression says everything you need to know about breakfast quality. Conversation is minimal, mouths are full, heads are pounding. Regret is thick in the air. Someone asks what day it is. No one answers. The cook ladles out another portion. It lands with a sound that can only be described as apologetic. She shrugs. You shrug back. Food safety is not a concept here. Leftovers are reused until they vanish. Spoilage is masked with herbs. Mould is scraped off or stirred in. Nothing is thrown away unless it walks off on its own. Even then there is debate. Illness from food is common: constipation, diarrhea, stomach cramps, burping that smells like ancestral guilt. Remedies include charcoal, mint, wine, and lying very still until you stop vibrating. But the food does its job. It fills your stomach. It dulls the memory of whatever was in that cup last night. It gives you just enough energy to face the rest of the day, which is important, because now that breakfast is over, the real work begins. Cleaning. You do not want to clean, but no one wants to clean. And today it's your turn. You're still chewing when someone places a bucket in your hands. It is damp, it is heavy, and it smells like someone tried to trap a storm cloud inside it, using nothing but failure and cabbage. Your assignment is clear. It is your turn to clean. In a medieval brothel, there were no dedicated janitors, no shift rotations, no mop closets, just an unspoken schedule passed around like a curse. If you stayed the night, you paid for it in more ways than one, and today your payment involves a stack of rags, a cracked basin, and several buckets that have clearly seen things they wish they hadn't. You begin in the hallway. The floor creaks underfoot, not because it is old, although it is, but because it has absorbed centuries of liquid regret. The straw scattered across the boards is meant to soak up messes and smells. In practice, it simply adds texture, a rough, crunchy texture that crackles like dried leaves every time you step wrong. You sweep first, or at least attempt to. The broom is mostly handle. The bristles resemble the tail of a particularly abused squirrel. It moves more dust than it collects. After a few swipes, you give up and start kicking things into piles instead. The chamber pots are next. They line the walls like little ceramic monuments to gastrointestinal honesty. Each one a time capsule from the night before. Some are full, some are fuller, all of them are warm. You carry them carefully, holding your breath, praying silently that the bottoms hold. Chamber pots were standard in brothels. With no plumbing and little privacy, they were the only option for most clients and workers. Made from clay or metal, sometimes wood, they were tucked under beds, behind curtains, or simply left in the hallway for someone else to deal with. They were emptied when convenient, which meant whenever someone lost a bet or ran out of excuses. You carry each one to the backyard pit, a hole dug hastily and lined with stone if you were lucky. Sometimes the contents were dumped directly into the street gutter. Sometimes they were flung out a window. Laws existed against this. Signs were posted. But at 3 a.m, no one is thinking about municipal regulations when they're aiming out a second-story window after too much plum wine and pickled fish. After the pots, there are linens, so many linens, sheets, towels, rags, all soaked in a combination of sweat, ale, and whatever was in that ointment the healer used. You gather them into a heap. They are heavy. They stick to your hands. One of them moves slightly. You decide not to look. Washing linens in a medieval brothel involved a complex process known as barely trying. Water was hauled from the river or well, heated if there was time, and poured into a basin with ash soap or lye. The linens were soaked, scrubbed with a wooden paddle, wrung out, and then hung to dry over ropes strung across the yard. Birds frequently interrupted this process. So did passing dogs. Clean was a relative term. Whiter than before, less sticky than expected, not actively buzzing with flies. These were the goals. Once dry, linens were reused immediately. There were never enough. Some brothels tried colour coding them. Red for rooms, brown for mopping, white for clients. Within a week they were all the same colour anyway. Next, the floors. You splash water over the boards, it spreads into the cracks and disappears. This is considered good enough. You sprinkle herbs over everything to improve the scent. Rosemary, thyme, mint if someone hasn't eaten it all. This is less about cleanliness and more about olfactory confusion. If it smells like a salad, people assume it's clean. You move to the rooms, beds are remade or restuffed. Straw is swapped out. Sometimes only the top layer. You fluff the pillow, it wheezes. You stop touching it. Candles are replaced, chamber pots repositioned, curtains shaken out. You avoid the splinters. Brothel maintenance was constant. Fires had to be watched, walls patched, doors rehung, windows repaired after drunken miscalculations, buckets relined, ointment jars refilled, rats discouraged, chickens relocated. Every task was someone's problem, and if no one else was around, it became yours. The kitchen needs scrubbing. The cauldron from breakfast has formed a crust. You chip at it. It chips back. Dishes stacked in a corner. Flies circle them like tiny landlords. You rinse each one in a tub of water that is more grey than wet. You dry them with cloths that may or may not be rags from the wash heap. You place them neatly on the shelf and pretend none of this happened. Someone brings you a bucket of sand. It is for the floor. You toss it around and sweep again. The sand absorbs moisture and odour. It also gives the room a nice crunch. Clients like that. Makes them feel grounded. By midday the place is almost respectable. The rooms smell like herbs. The floors are only slightly damp, the sheets are less crunchy. You have emptied every pot, mopped every stain, beaten every rug and only gagged 6 times. This is considered a good morning. You sit in the courtyard, wiping your hands on a cloth that once dreamed of being white. The cat from earlier jumps into your lap. You consider naming it. You decide not to. Naming things in a brothel is dangerous. You might get attached. And then you hear the knock. Not the healer, not the inspector, not the nobles. It is the baker. Because no medieval brothel could function without bread. And today he brings more than loaves. He brings gossip. The knock at the door is heavier than usual, rhythmic, confident. The kind of knock that belongs to someone who delivers more than just bread. You open the door to find the baker standing there with a sack slung over one shoulder, and a look that suggests he knows more about what happens in this building than anyone should. He steps inside without waiting for an invitation. He always does. The baker is not just a supplier, he is part of the machine. Every brothel needs him, not just for bread, but for the network he represents. Behind every medieval brothel was a web of vendors, merchants, and tradespeople who kept the place running whether they admitted it or not. He sets down his sack with a thud. Inside are loaves, dense, dark, tough enough to break a tooth, perfect for brothel use. Bread that doesn't crumble, bread that can double as a plate, bread that can survive 3 days under a bed and still be served without comment. Bakers were essential to urban life. Bread was the staple food for everyone from beggars to barons. In brothels it was served at every meal, used to soak up stew, or handed to patrons as a gesture of hospitality. No one came here expecting roast goose. They came expecting something edible that wouldn't scream when bitten. But the baker doesn't just bring bread, he brings news. Which markets are flush, which guards are taking bribes, which priest was seen leaving which back door. He collects gossip with the same efficiency he collects coin, and he trades it for favours, a quieter inspection, a discount on flour, a warning about an angry husband with a sword and poor aim. He takes out a second bundle, cheese wrapped in cloth. It smells like it has opinions. You nod gratefully. Even bad cheese is still cheese. The workers will fight over it later. The supply chain of a medieval brothel was both invisible and indispensable. Without it, the building would collapse in 2 days. Bakers brought bread, butchers brought cheap cuts, brewers delivered ale by the barrel, candle makers kept the place dimly lit, laundresses picked up bundles of horror and returned them slightly less horrifying. Apothecaries dropped off jars of ointment, powders, and other legal miracles. Each one pretended not to know what the brothel did. Each one knew exactly what the brothel did, and each one knew they couldn't afford to lose the business. You follow the baker to the kitchen. He speaks in code. The meat man is late. The new brewer is using less barley. The soap seller's son was caught peeking through the shutters. You nod along. It's a strange ballet. Everyone circling the truth without stepping in it. Sometimes tradesmen delivered through back doors, not for secrecy, just for convenience. The front door was for clients and drama. The back door was for sacks of onions, jugs of wine, bundles of sticks, and the occasional goose. Brothel alleys were often more crowded than the main streets. Money changed hands quickly, in coins, in bread, in favours. A free loaf here, a discount there. Everyone kept a mental ledger. Everyone owed someone something. The economy was fragile. A bad harvest, a sick brewer, a missing butcher, and suddenly the whole place starved. But barter was common too. A pound of sausage for an hour of silence. A jug of vinegar for a promise not to mention who fell out of which window. Not every deal was written down. Some were grunted, some were winked. Some were settled with a handshake that left grease behind. You carry the bread to the storage room. It's cooler in here. Smells of flour and mildew. You stack the loaves on the shelf. A rat watches you from the corner. You nod. It nods back. This is your relationship now. The baker asks about the guard rotation. You tell him what you heard. He nods, satisfied. He trades you a slice of dried apple and disappears through the back with the grace of someone who knows how to vanish before someone asks him to carry a bucket. You return to the main room. The deliveries are done. The pantry is full enough. The ale barrels are sweating in the heat. The candle stubs are replaced. The house is ready for another night. Because brothels never rest. They breathe, they eat, they demand constant care. And now that the day's labour is done, the sun begins to set, which means it's time to prepare. Not for pleasure, not for rest, but for the customers who come when the shadows grow long, and some of them are not strangers. Some of them wear rings. The sun sinks low and the walls of the brothel start to hum again. Not with music, not with laughter, but with that slow rising tension that always precedes the arrival of the night crowd. You recognise the signs, the hurried straightening of linens, the last swipe of an oily rag across a tabletop, the faint scent of rosemary and boiled socks, and then they start arriving. Some are merchants with crooked teeth and fat coin purses. Others are labourers with raw hands and nothing to spend but a few coppers and an hour of forgetfulness. But among them are the ones who always draw attention, the ones with soft hands, clean boots and rings, wedding rings. They arrive with their heads down, they wear cloaks with hoods pulled low, they speak quietly. Some remove their rings before they enter, most do not. The rings glint in the candlelight like tiny mirrors reflecting every silent promise they do not intend to keep. In medieval society, marriage was sacred in theory and negotiable in practice. It was a religious ceremony, a legal contract, a social performance, and sometimes even a property exchange. Husbands were expected to be faithful. Wives were expected to be faithful and silent. The brothel existed in the space between these expectations, a pressure valve for a culture that prized chastity while quietly ignoring it. The men who came here were often pillars of the community: bakers, aldermen, priests, knights. Some claimed they were here for the company, some for the wine. Some insisted they were only delivering a message or checking on a cousin. None of them believed it. None of them cared. And still they wore the rings. Wedding rings in the Middle Ages were not always gold. They were made from iron, bronze, or twisted strands of silver. Some were engraved. Others were simple bands. They were symbols of union, but also of property. A man gave a ring to claim a wife. A woman wore it to signal her status. Love was optional. Ownership was not. Yet here they were, in the brothel, wearing those same rings while handing over coins for the hour. Some removed them with great care and placed them in small pouches. Others spun them around their fingers absent-mindedly while drinking spiced ale and laughing at jokes they didn't understand. Some men brought tokens from home, a bit of embroidery, a ribbon, a half-eaten plum cake. They would leave them on the nightstand like small apologies to the air, as if a piece of home made the act less foreign, as if bringing the scent of their wife's perfume could somehow bless the act of betrayal. You watch one of them now. He sits on a bench near the fire. He's not drunk. He's not ashamed. He stares at the flames and twists the ring on his finger like it is a question he cannot answer. He will leave in an hour. He will go home. He will kiss his wife on the cheek and say nothing. Wives, for their part, knew. Not all, but many. They knew where their husbands went when they stayed out late. They knew the smell of cheap ale and rosemary sweat. They knew what silence meant. Some confronted, some endured. Some made quiet deals behind closed doors to maintain the household, protect the children, or simply avoid scandal. The church preached fidelity. Adultery was a sin, but enforcement was inconsistent. A man caught in a brothel might be fined or shamed. A woman caught doing the same might lose everything. The double standard was not subtle. It was printed on the walls. Marriage manuals existed. They advised couples to love each other, to be gentle, to be fruitful. And then they quietly reminded husbands that the flesh was weak and sin was inevitable. Confess, repent, repeat. Brothel workers recognized the married ones. They could spot them by the way they hesitated, the way they talked too much, or too little. Some confessed things no one asked to hear. Others remained silent except to state their price. Some requested unusual things: gentle conversation, a lullaby, a hand to hold. It was not always about the body. Sometimes it was about the moment. A pause in the performance of daily life. A quiet room, a face that would not judge, and a ring that remained on the finger even when everything else was removed. You find it strange, this ritual, this constant dance between devotion and denial. but it is part of the brothel's rhythm, as predictable as the squeak of the mattress or the scent of boiled turnip. The men come, the rings stay, and the doors remain open. But the real tragedy is not in the act itself, it is in the quiet aftermath. Because tomorrow these same men will return to their homes, their wives, their prayers, and the brothel will still be here, waiting, with the sheets changed, the floor swept, and the ring-shaped marks still visible on the skin of their fingers. There's a misconception that medieval brothels were lawless, that they operated on chaos alone, that once you stepped through the door, society stopped, the rules dissolved, and anything went as long as you paid. This is incorrect. In reality, the brothel had more rules than a monastery, and often enforced them more aggressively. Because if you want to run a place that welcomes half the town's population by sunset, you need structure, you need boundaries, you need the kind of internal policy that can turn a drunk noble into a quiet apology within 5 minutes. The rules weren't always written down. Some were carved into wooden beams, some were posted behind the bar, others were communicated by a hard stare or a broom handle to the shin. But they existed, and if you broke them, the punishment came swiftly, and it almost never involved words. The most basic rule was no violence, no striking the workers, no fighting the other patrons, no smashing chairs, even if they squeaked like your ex-wife. This was enforced not out of morality, but economics. Chairs were expensive, beds were even more so. Every time someone broke a piece of furniture, it set the house back 2 days' worth of salted meat and candle stubs. Patrons who got too rowdy were dragged out by their ankles and deposited face down in the mud. Repeat offenders were banned, which often meant someone threw their shoes into the nearest latrine and told the guards to ignore the screams. The next rule was no stealing. You'd think this was obvious, but in a room full of distracted people, unattended coins had a way of migrating. Rings disappeared, purses lightened. Occasionally someone made off with a linen sheet or a bar of soap, which was bold considering neither of those items smelled like anything you'd want close to your skin. The punishment for theft varied. Public humiliation was common. The thief might be paraded through the tavern with a chamber pot on their head. Sometimes they were stripped naked and locked in the courtyard overnight. It was not about justice, it was about theatre. Privacy was another sacred rule. What happened behind the curtain stayed there. Patrons who tried to peek, listen, or wander into the wrong room were dealt with like curious raccoons, smacked, scolded, and in some cases chased with a mop. Workers were allowed to refuse service, and those who ignored this found themselves on the wrong end of a thrown shoe or a visit from the brothel's informal security team, which usually consisted of the cook and a ladle. There were also curfews, not for the patrons but for the building itself. Doors closed at a certain hour, windows were shuttered, no loitering in the hallway, no singing after midnight unless you were being paid to do it. The brothel might have been a place of chaos during business hours, but it ran on routine. Cleaners needed space to work, healers needed quiet, and nobody wanted to mop around a man trying to recite poetry to his own reflection. Dress codes existed too. You couldn't walk in wearing armour, not just because it dented the furniture, but because it made everyone nervous. A man in chainmail was either expecting a fight or fleeing one. Weapons had to be left at the door, shields were discouraged, guests who refused to comply were politely escorted out using a method known as shouting and pushing. There were rules for the workers as well. They were expected to keep themselves presentable, which was a flexible term. Hair brushed, teeth mostly intact, no visible sores unless they could be explained as insect bites. Clean linens were encouraged, even if that meant flipping them over between clients. They were expected to avoid open quarrels, especially in front of customers. Those who broke the peace were reprimanded privately or given the worst shifts: the window rooms, the ones near the latrines, the ones that smelled like damp wheat and disappointment. Punishments for workers varied depending on the keeper's mood and the worker's status. Newer hires might be yelled at. Veterans might be forgiven. Some were docked pay. Others were assigned cleaning duty. The worst offence was betrayal. Stealing from the house, smuggling out a client, or lying about illness. These infractions could result in dismissal, banishment, or worse, being handed over to the city guards. No one wanted that, not even the guards. There was also a strict rule about fire: no candles near straw, no smoking herbs indoors, no torches upstairs. This was drilled into everyone. A single spark could turn the building into an inferno. Brothels were made of wood, cloth, and secrets. All of them burned fast. If you caused a fire, you didn't get punished. You got remembered as the idiot who turned the house into a cautionary tale. The rules extended to finances. Credit was discouraged. Bartering was allowed, but only with approval. Patrons who tried to pay in songs, promises, or favours were laughed at and then thrown out. The brothel accepted coin, sometimes goods, occasionally discreet services, but never poetry. That was a hard rule. And then there were the unspoken rules. Don't get attached. Don't ask real names. Don't fall asleep where you don't belong. Don't bring in strangers without warning. Don't cry in the common room. Don't leave your boots on the table. Don't feed the cat anything you're not willing to eat yourself. You learn the rules quickly. Everyone does. If you don't, you end up outside in your undergarments explaining to a passing monk why you're covered in feathers and ale. The rules are not about order. They're about survival. They are what keep the brothel from collapsing under the weight of its own filth and folly. They are what make the workers feel safe, or as close to safe as anyone can be in a building where privacy is a curtain and sanitation is a rumour. Tonight the rules will be enforced as usual, quietly, efficiently, and with very little patience. Because the brothel might welcome everyone, but it does not tolerate nonsense. And as you drift off to sleep, tucked into a straw pile that crunches like old parchment, you hear the unmistakable sound of a man being tossed down the stairs for snoring too loudly into someone else's mug. The rules, after all, are there for a reason, and now that the house is quiet again, the healer returns, this time with something stronger. Not ointment, but spirits. The cup is handed to you with a wink and a warning. You're told to sip slowly. You're also told that the last man who drank it fast hasn't spoken in 3 days. This is how you meet the brothel's version of spirits. Not ghosts, liquor. Although the effects are often the same, up until now most of what you've drunk has been ale. Thin, warm and weak enough to bathe in. But spirits are something else entirely. These are not brewed. They are boiled, distilled, purified, if such a word can be applied to a process involving charred pots and questionable intentions. This is the stuff that comes out in small batches, smells like betrayal, and goes down like regret. Distilling alcohol in the medieval period was part science, part sorcery, and mostly guesswork. The process involved heating fermented liquid until it turned to vapour, then cooling it until it turned back into liquid. What came out was strong, sometimes dangerously so, sometimes lethally so. It depended on the ingredients, the method, and how much the person making it sneezed during the process. In brothels, spirits were brewed in back rooms, cellars, or hidden stills made from patched copper and hope. They were created from whatever was available: wine, barley mash, spoiled fruit, honey, figs, herbs, and once, according to local legend, mashed eels. The results were bottled in reused jars, sold in small amounts, and served only to those brave enough or foolish enough to ask. You sip, it burns immediately. Not in the mouth, that would be too kind. It burns in the nose, the throat, the chest, and then radiates outward until your earlobes feel like they've been slapped by a monk. The taste is indescribable. If you were forced, you might say it resembles turpentine filtered through an old sock and blessed with a whisper of pear. But only a whisper, the kind that flees before it arrives. Spirits in brothels were not consumed for flavour, they were consumed for speed. Ale took time, wine needed volume, spirits worked fast. A single cup could erase memory, erase caution, and sometimes erase the feeling in your legs. They were also used medicinally. The healer often carried a flask of spirits, not to drink, but to clean wounds, or to pretend to clean them, or to pour directly onto boils while muttering about demonic humours. Some believed the vapours warded off illness, others believed they attracted it. Both were correct in different ways. There were no safety standards, no consistency. One bottle might make you sing, the next might make you see angels, the one after that might make you blind for a week, and then return your vision with minor hallucinations and a strange urge to climb furniture. Distilled drinks were called many things: aqua vitae, firewater, monk's breath, saint's tears, devil's kiss. The names changed, but the effect remained the same: a liquid hammer to the senses, a shortcut to confidence, a cheap thrill in a world where nothing came cheap. In wealthier cities, distillation was more refined. Apothecaries used glass stills, precise measurements, and exotic ingredients. Their concoctions were sold as elixirs, tonics, or perfumes. But in the brothel, the process was closer to alchemy gone rogue. The goal was intoxication. The side effects were part of the charm. Some spirits were flavoured, with anise, with fennel, with bits of cinnamon bark stolen from spice carts. Others were bitter and black, infused with burnt herbs or bark. Occasionally someone added honey to smooth the flavour. This was considered generous, though it rarely helped. You look around the room, others are drinking too. One man is attempting to whistle through his nose, another is staring at a candle and nodding. A woman is dancing with a stool. Everyone is in their own little universe. It is unclear if anyone paid. It is unclear if anyone remembers. The keeper watches carefully. Spirits were profitable but risky. Too much, and the room became a riot. Too little, and the patrons went elsewhere. The balance had to be maintained. Some houses imposed limits, 1 cup per hour. Others encouraged excess. More drink meant more courage, more coin, and more cleaning later. Spirits also carried status. A guest who drank heavily without falling over was admired. A worker who could handle 3 shots was considered invincible. A healer who drank during treatment was considered inspired, or dangerous, or both. You feel the effects creeping in: warmth, dizziness, a slight buzzing in your teeth. You blink and the room seems both larger and smaller. The stool looks more comfortable. The walls look more judgmental. Your fingers feel like they belong to someone else. This is normal. This is expected. This is why people keep coming back. Not for the taste, not for the service, not even for the company. But for the moment when the world fades just enough to become bearable. When the straw smells like home. When the candlelight looks like stars. When the rules seem soft and the regrets seem far away. And just as you think the night cannot get any stranger, someone begins singing. Not loudly, not well, but with conviction. And the entire room joins in. Because in a medieval brothel, the spirits did not just fill the cup, they filled the silence. The room is glowing now. Not from joy or cleanliness, but from the dozens of candles stuck into every available surface. There are wax stubs in wall sconces, dripping stumps on tables, and one particularly heroic candle wedged into a crack in the floorboards. It leans at a worrying angle, flickering with the arrogance of something that knows no one will stop it. This is the hour when everything feels like it might catch fire. Because it might. Brothels in the Middle Ages were built from the most flammable substances known to man. Dry wood, thatch, oilcloth, straw, feather-stuffed mattresses, drapes made from old sackcloth, hair, sweat, alcohol fumes. All of it wrapped into a structure held together by friction and superstition. Fire was a constant threat, not an occasional accident, a daily possibility, something everyone expected but no one truly prepared for. A single misplaced candle, a tipped oil lamp, a chimney left uncleaned, a curtain flapping too close to an open flame. That was all it took. And yet, people kept lighting candles, because there was no alternative. Medieval lighting options were few and terrible. Sunlight if you were lucky, torches if you were rich, but mostly candles, made from tallow, which was rendered animal fat. They burned with a greasy smoke and smelled like cooked goat. Beeswax candles were better, but they cost more than most workers made in a week. So the brothel glowed by pig fat and desperation. The placement of candles in brothels followed no known safety standard. They were balanced on barrels, tucked into wine bottles, jammed into skulls or empty cups. Sometimes they were nailed to bits of wood that hung from the ceiling by string. If one fell, no one noticed. If two fell, someone shouted. If three fell, the cat ran under the table and everyone else panicked. The workers were used to it. Every brothel had a routine. Candles lit before dark, replaced every few hours. Wicks trimmed with a knife that also opened ale barrels and removed splinters. Wax was collected and remoulded whenever possible. The floors were swept of clumps that melted into strange grey blobs. If your foot stuck to one, you pretended not to notice. But accidents happened. One house famously went up in flames after someone tried to warm a bath using a brazier filled with coal and brandy. Another burned when a drunken client mistook a lantern for a chamber pot and urinated into it, which somehow made things worse. One brothel caught fire twice in 1 week. The second time was blamed on divine punishment. The first was blamed on a curtain and an enthusiastic song about shepherds. Fire prevention was minimal. Buckets of water were kept by the door. Sand was scattered across the floor. Blankets were dunked and draped over embers. There were no fire codes, no drills. If the building started to burn, everyone screamed and ran for the street. Insurance did not exist. If your brothel burned down, you rebuilt it. If it took half the neighbourhood with it, you apologised loudly and moved to another street. Some cities passed laws to prevent fires in brothels. No open flames after midnight. No lanterns in the attic. No cooking in the bedrooms. These rules were ignored. Candles were cheaper than fines, and clients preferred candlelight. It was dim, forgiving, easier to lie under. The structure of the brothel made everything worse. Narrow hallways, low ceilings, wooden beams soaked in ale, bedding stacked near the hearth, linen curtains that acted like fuses. The layout turned every flame into a potential funeral. Even the fireplaces were hazards. Built from crumbling stone choked with soot, they belched smoke and occasionally sparks. Some had chimneys, most did not. A clogged flue meant smoke backed into the room. The solution was to open the window, or wave a towel, or hope no one fainted. Cooking fires were another threat. The kitchen operated all night. Stew pots, fry pans, clay ovens, all burning with little supervision, oil splashed, cloth caught. The cook kept a wet rag nearby but relied more on yelling. Sometimes it worked. The workers had their own tricks. Hair tied back, sleeves rolled up. No long hems near the stove. Buckets filled before a shift. If a curtain caught fire, they knew to smother it with a wool cloak or a mattress, unless the mattress was also on fire. You lie in your bed staring at the ceiling. Above you is a candle stuck in a wooden sconce. The wax is pooled. The flame leans sideways. It dances when someone walks by. You think about the building, how quickly it would go up, how little stands between you and the sky. You wonder if the straw mattress would ignite first, or the curtain at your feet, or the towel hanging from the chair that's currently too close to the hearth. The idea does not comfort you. It does not scare you either. It simply is. Because everyone in the brothel lives with the knowledge that fire is always waiting. Outside the door. Inside the walls. in the breath of the next drunken client waving a torch to impress someone who is not impressed. There are stories of brothels that burned in the night and no one noticed until morning, of patrons found fused to beds, of workers escaping barefoot with nothing but a candle still clutched in one hand. Some claim to have seen fire devils dancing in the ashes, others just saw soot and started over, and still the candles are lit, because no one wants to live in darkness, even if it might kill them. You roll over and blow out your candle, the room goes dark, and for a moment the silence feels like safety, until someone lights a new one in the hallway. And the glow returns. You're not asleep. Not really. Just lying still, listening to the creaks in the ceiling and the slow hiss of wax melting onto a stone floor. The building has settled. The crowd has thinned. The last drunk has stopped singing. For now, there is silence, until the knock comes. It is not the knock of a customer or a supplier. It is heavier, slower, deliberate. This is the kind of knock that demands the door be opened not out of courtesy, but out of obligation. You already know who it is. The church has arrived. In theory, the church condemned brothels. It preached chastity, denounced lust, and reminded the faithful that carnal pleasure was a sin unless it involved procreation within the boundaries of marriage. In practice, however, the church had a more nuanced approach. It tolerated brothels, regulated them, taxed them. In some cities it even owned them. Clergy did not simply turn a blind eye. They walked through the door. There are records of bishops who managed entire red light districts, monks who issued licenses to brothel keepers, nuns who visited to offer moral instruction, and sometimes left with payment. The church positioned itself not as an opponent of brothels, but as their chaperone. Some cities had church-run houses of repentance for workers who wished to leave the trade. These were less sanctuaries and more holding pens, where women were locked in, shaved bald and given bread crusts and Bible verses until they confessed to sins no one had asked about. Many returned to the brothel the moment they escaped. Inside the brothel, the arrival of clergy was a mixed blessing. A priest might offer confession, hear the sins of patrons who had just committed them, and then accept donations for absolution. A travelling friar might set up shop in the corner, selling indulgences like bread rolls. 1 coin for forgiveness. 2 if you wanted to wipe the slate clean and start fresh before supper. You hear footsteps now, sandals on wood, the mutter of Latin prayers, the smell of incense and wet wool drifting through the hallway. No one meets their eyes. No one speaks unless spoken to. The church does not like to be acknowledged when it is somewhere it shouldn't be. There are rules about when and how the church may intervene. In some towns it conducts inspections, not of cleanliness or safety, but of souls. Workers are asked if they attend Mass, if they understand the nature of their sin, if they have considered a life of penance. The answers are always yes, because anything else brings punishment. The church demands compliance but offers little support. It tells workers to repent but does not offer jobs or shelter. It asks them to leave the brothel but does not pay their debts. It instructs them to be pure but does not feed them. The cycle continues. Sin, shame, forgiveness, repeat. There are exceptions. A few clergy speak gently, offer real help, smuggle out the young and the sick. But they are rare. Most simply appear, recite, collect, and vanish, leaving behind only silence and the faint scent of sanctified smoke. The brothel keeper greets the priest now, with a nod, a purse of coins, a muttered phrase in the local dialect that roughly translates to "you've seen nothing, and you'll keep seeing nothing." The priest blesses the doorway, sprinkles water that smells like copper and roses, and accepts the money without breaking eye contact. There are rumours that certain brothels offer discounts to clergy. Others provide special rooms, quiet ones, away from the main floor. where no one asks names and the candles are always lit before the guest arrives. No records exist, but everyone knows. You lie still and listen as the priest moves through the hallway. He pauses at your door, murmurs something under his breath, and continues. You're not sure if it was a blessing or a warning. Possibly both. The brothel lives in tension, between condemnation and protection, between sin and necessity. It provides what the church will not, and then pays the church to pretend otherwise. It is both the symptom and the solution. A place where flesh and spirit are sold in equal measure. Some cities require brothel workers to attend Mass weekly, not to cleanse their souls, but to remind them who is watching. Others forbid them from entering churches entirely, as if the walls would crack under the weight of their presence, as if the roof would fall. One priest wrote that brothels were like cesspools. Disgusting, yes, but necessary to keep the filth from spilling into the streets. It was better, he said, to contain the lust in one place than to let it seep into the homes of the righteous. This was printed, approved, quoted for generations. You close your eyes. Outside, the church bell tolls, distant, hollow. A reminder that Sunday is near and sin has an expiration date. Tomorrow the brothel will clean its floors, wash its sheets, and pretend to be something else. The priest will return to his pulpit. The patrons will kneel and cross themselves. The workers will bow their heads and mumble prayers they do not believe in. And for 1 hour everything will be forgiven. Until night falls again and the candles are relit. It begins with a cough. Not a discreet one, not a polite throat clear, but a deep rattling sound that echoes through the hallway like a warning bell muffled by mildew. You pretend not to hear it. Everyone does. Because in a medieval brothel, the moment someone acknowledges a cough, everything changes. Disease is the ghost that haunts every corner of this place. Not a whispering phantom in the rafters, but a very real, very visible threat that clings to sheets, skin, and straw with equal determination. The brothel is built on contact. Bodies touching bodies, hands on shoulders, breath in faces. When sickness arrives, it arrives fast. You think about the last time you saw someone disappear. One day they were sitting by the fire with a cup of wine. The next, their bedding was burned and no one said their name again. It was always just a cold, or a rash, or a bit of dizziness, until it wasn't. Plague was the fear that lived under every floorboard. Bubonic, pneumonic, septicemic. No one knew which was which. They just knew it came quickly, turned skin black, made eyes swell shut, and left entire buildings empty. When it swept through town, brothels shut their doors if they could, but most could not afford to. The work continued. The bodies kept arriving. In theory, there were methods of prevention. Bundles of herbs were hung from ceilings. Sage, lavender, rosemary, sometimes garlic strung like beads above doorways. People carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with cloves and camphor, which they pressed to their faces every time someone sneezed. The brothel workers wore sprigs of mint tucked behind their ears and rubbed vinegar into their skin between visits. These rituals helped them feel clean, even if they weren't. Some cities imposed quarantine laws. Brothels had to close during outbreaks. Workers were examined by city-appointed physicians who looked for signs of plague by poking rashes with sticks and asking if anyone had vomited blood lately. If the answer was yes, the entire house might be boarded up, its inhabitants sealed inside with enough food for 3 days and enough prayers to last until the rats stopped scratching at the walls. But smaller infections were more common. Syphilis, gonorrhea, scabies, lice, and the endless cycle of fevers, sores and coughs that came from being too close to too many people too often. The workers knew the signs: yellow discharge, pain when walking, a rash that looked like it had opinions. Clients were not told, sometimes out of fear, sometimes because they would not care. Treatments were rudimentary: mercury for the pox, boiled nettle tea for rashes, vinegar baths that stung more than they healed, hot stones placed on the stomach, cold compresses on the chest, leeches on anything that did not move fast enough. The healer prescribed garlic in every form: raw, roasted, pounded into paste and applied to the groin like a curse. Hygiene was inconsistent. Linens were washed in boiling water when available. Beds were scrubbed with ash. Buckets of lye were thrown across floors. The air was perfumed with smoke from burning herbs, not because it worked, but because it smelled like someone was trying. It gave the illusion of control. You sit now with your back against a wall that has seen too many seasons. Your skin itches. You tell yourself it's the straw. Someone sneezes in the next room. You hold your breath. You count to 10. You release it slowly, pretending it means something. When plague came close, everything became quiet. Fewer customers, fewer laughs, more people sleeping in their own clothes, facing the door, keeping their shoes on. No one shared cups. No one kissed. Everyone pretended the walls could hold it out. And when it hit the brothel directly, things moved quickly. The sick were moved to a separate room, usually the attic, sometimes the basement. Food was left outside the door. No one entered except the healer, and only then if they were feeling ambitious or drunk. The straw from those rooms was burned. So were the linens. So was the mattress, if someone could carry it out without gagging. Death was not announced. It was assumed. If someone disappeared and their bed was empty the next morning, no one asked. Their name was wiped from the wall. Their bowl was washed. Their things divided. The brothel could not afford mourning. The church offered prayers, but not much else. Some clergy believed the plague was a punishment for sin. Brothels were blamed. Women were blamed. Foreigners, beggars, cats, and comets were blamed. Anyone except the rats and the filth and the constant, inescapable contact. And yet the brothel remained open. Because there was no choice. The workers could not stop working. The clients did not stop arriving. The risk became part of the transaction. You pay your coin, you take your chance. And if you wake up with a fever, you do not speak of it. You drink the vinegar, you light a candle, you say nothing. And if you survive, you return. Because survival was its own kind of prayer, and the brothel was its own kind of altar. Someone new has arrived. You can hear it before you see her. Nervous footsteps, hesitant breathing. The kind of silence that only comes from someone trying very hard not to be noticed. You glance toward the common room and there she is, standing near the wall, clutching a bundle of rags that might have been a dress in a past life. She looks young, too young, but that's how it always starts. No one is born into the brothel, not officially. They arrive, pushed, pulled, or simply left. Some come from the countryside, others from neighbouring towns. Most are poor, many are desperate. A few still believe they're just passing through. Almost none of them plan to end up here. In theory, brothel work was a choice. In practice, it was what happened when all other choices were taken away. For many young women, the decision wasn't theirs. It belonged to a father, a stepmother, a guardian, or a debt collector. Girls were offered up to pay for rent, to settle accounts, to avoid starvation. Some were told it was just for a little while. Others were never told anything at all. Recruitment was rarely open or honest. Brothel keepers rarely advertised. They didn't have to. Word of mouth did the work. So did desperation. A girl turned away from her village for being pregnant. A widow unable to find a trade. A runaway with no coins and no shoes. They all found their way to the brothel eventually, or were found by someone who profited from delivering them. Some brothels operated under a thin veil of respectability. They promised food, shelter, and wages. They promised safety. They promised to teach a skill. What they delivered was control. A place to sleep, yes, but under conditions that were almost impossible to escape. Debt piled quickly. rent for the bed, fees for clothing, deductions for food, candles, and medicine. A new recruit was in debt before she ever saw a client. The first days were the worst. Girls were stripped of their belongings, washed, roughly, inspected by the healer, given a new name or told not to use one at all. They were assigned a room or a corner of a shared room and told to watch, to listen, to learn. The workers didn't speak much at first. Some pitied the newcomers, others resented them. Everyone remembered what it felt like to be the new one. Training was informal, no lessons, just instructions barked in the hallway. Smile, don't talk back, don't look them in the eyes unless they pay first, don't eat anything left behind in the room, don't fall asleep during a visit, don't ask questions, keep your mouth shut unless you're being paid to open it. Some girls cried, others hardened, a few disappeared after a week, some were pulled out by family, some ran, some were never mentioned again. The brothel didn't mark these absences. It filled the bed with someone else. The building was always hungry. You watch the girl now. She's seated on a stool near the fire. Someone has handed her a cup of something warm and bitter. She sips it slowly. Her eyes are wide, but she does not look frightened anymore. Just hollow. Like she's already understood something she was never supposed to learn. In some cities, brothel apprenticeships were semi-formalized. Girls were registered, their ages recorded, their services categorized. This was not protection. It was inventory. Records were kept for tax purposes, not safety. A girl might be listed in the city ledgers with a single line. Age, hair color, fee. She could be removed just as easily. Church officials occasionally inspected brothels to ensure no one underage was working. These visits were brief and predictable. The youngest were hidden. The oldest were made to look younger. Everyone else nodded along to whatever the priest asked and lied smoothly. If the inspection was inconvenient, a coin changed hands, and the priest found nothing at all. Brothel keepers knew how to walk the line. They offered food and housing, claimed the girls were there by choice, and insisted they were merely offering shelter in hard times. Some even employed a madam, usually an older worker who trained the new ones. These women had survived long enough to be trusted with keeping the illusion of safety alive. You wonder how many more will come. How many girls will sit on that same stool, wear that same borrowed dress, and sip that same bitter drink while their lives are rewritten by necessity. There is no ceremony, no welcome, just a quiet shift in the building's rhythm as another body is added to the ledger. And tomorrow she'll work, because she must, because no one else will feed her, because the town does not want her, because the brothel is the only door that stayed open, and once she enters, it rarely opens again. The girl from earlier is gone now, not gone as in vanished, but gone as in absorbed. She's found her place in the building, or at least been assigned one. Her walk is slower, her eyes are lower. She no longer flinches at every creak in the floor. This is how the brothel changes people. Quietly, daily, without asking. And yet, despite all this, someone will fall in love with her. It happens more often than you'd expect. In a place built entirely on transaction, where every gesture has a price and every smile is calculated, love still finds its way in. Or something that looks like love. Or something that desperately wants to be love, even if it's just a shared illusion wrapped in sweat and candle smoke. Falling in love in a brothel is not romantic. It is inconvenient. It disrupts the system. It creates risk where none is welcome. But it happens anyway. A client returns one too many times. A worker begins saving scraps of bread for someone specific. A glance lasts a second too long. A hand lingers. A name is whispered and not forgotten. The economics of the brothel do not allow for romance. Affection slows things down. It interferes with earnings. It blurs the line between work and survival. But the heart, as usual, does not care about ledger books. It wanders, it stumbles, it latches onto whoever is kindest or quietest or most broken in the same way. Some clients believe they are rescuing someone. They come with flowers or coins or promises. They whisper plans of escape, of marriage, of a new life in another town. The worker nods, smiles, asks for payment. The story ends the same way every time. Either he stops returning or she starts believing him. Both are dangerous. There are stories of girls who tried to run away with patrons. Some made it. Most didn't. The brothel knew how to keep its workers. Debts, threats, chains, sometimes metaphorical, sometimes not. The client would be warned once, maybe twice. After that, someone might follow him home, not to harm him, but to remind him that romance was not part of the arrangement. Love between workers was just as complicated. The brothel was a place of constant proximity, shared hardship, and unspoken understanding. Bonds formed, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. A shared blanket on a cold night, a hand held during a fever, a whispered joke during a shift change. But even here, love came with consequences. Two workers in love risked everything. Favoritism meant missed opportunities. Jealousy meant fights. Pregnancy meant punishment or worse. The keeper would intervene if things got too personal, assign them different rooms, different clients, cut pay, remind them that this was a business, not a storybook. And yet, people still carved hearts into the walls. They shared tokens, ribbons, dried flowers, bread crusts with bite marks shaped like affection. They whispered nonsense to each other when the building was quiet. They touched elbows like it meant something. They left small gifts on pillows. They tried. You remember one? A girl who wore a string around her wrist, said it was from someone she loved. She never said his name, just touched the string when she was nervous. One day the string was gone. So was the girl. No one asked, no one needed to. The church, of course, had opinions. Love in a brothel was a sin wrapped in another sin, and served with a side of punishment. They preached chastity and penance, but they also wrote poetry, sang hymns about divine love, compared Christ to a bridegroom. Even the saints got romantic sometimes. Medieval literature was full of tragic brothel romances, ballads about knights falling for fallen women, tales of courtesans who gave up riches for one true kiss. These stories always ended badly. That was the point. They weren't meant to inspire, they were meant to warn. In reality, love in the brothel was never clean. It was messy, desperate, transactional, sometimes real, sometimes not, often both at once. A worker might love a client because he was kind, or because he tipped well, or because he didn't speak much. A client might love a worker because she laughed at his jokes, or because she reminded him of someone else, or because he had no one else. There were few happy endings, no dowries, no ceremonies, no quiet cottages on the edge of town. A brothel worker could not marry without permission. Even if she left, her past followed. The names stuck. The whispers lingered. The ring never came. You lie back on your mattress and stare at the ceiling. You wonder if anyone in the building is in love right now. If someone is holding a hand beneath a blanket. If someone is tracing a name into the dust on a windowsill. If someone is pretending their job is a secret and their feelings are not. The walls are thin here. You can hear everything. The soft laugh, the muttered apology, the silence that follows. In this place, love is not forbidden. It is simply ignored. And still, it keeps showing up, even where it is least welcome, even where it does the most damage. The morning always begins with a tally. Coins are counted, rooms are checked, sheets are inspected, not just for stains, but for what's missing. Because despite the rules, Despite the stairs, despite the ever-present broom handle behind the door, someone always tries to leave without paying. You can hear it now. Raised voices from the hallway. A worker saying she was promised a full silver. A client insisting he gave it. The keeper sighing, already halfway to the door with a belt in one hand and a ledger in the other. This is not a new situation. It happens more often than anyone wants to admit. Refusing to pay at a medieval brothel was not just rude, it was theft, a violation of contract, spoken or not. And unlike a market stall or a tavern, the brothel didn't have the luxury of filing complaints or waiting for a constable. It handled its own justice, swiftly, loudly, and in ways designed to discourage repeat offences. You peek through the curtain. The man looks like a merchant. Good boots, bad haircut. He's sweating more than the room requires. The keeper's already inspecting his purse, which is suspiciously empty for someone who just spent 3 hours in a room with wine, candles, and a woman who now looks like she wants to bite something. There are no second chances in this situation, not unless the client is a noble or connected to someone with a sword. Otherwise, the punishment is immediate. No one here cares why he cannot pay. Whether he forgot, whether he thought it was free, whether he lost the coin while dancing on a barrel. Excuses don't matter. The debt does. Brothels had a reputation to maintain. If word spread that people could leave without paying, the entire business would collapse. So they developed their own systems of enforcement. Some had muscle on staff, former soldiers, failed knights, large women with arms like barrels and no patience for negotiations. Others relied on humiliation, public shaming, rough ejections, and nights spent tied to a post outside the door with a sign around the neck. In some towns, brothels had arrangements with the local guards, not formal but mutually beneficial. If a worker was attacked or a client failed to pay, the guards would turn a blind eye while the brothel took its revenge. In return, they received discounts, free drinks, information, a warm corner on cold nights. The keeper is speaking now, calmly, too calmly. This is the tone that precedes something loud. The client is still protesting. He claims he only had a short visit, that he was promised a discount, that no one explained the rates. The worker crosses her arms and says nothing. She doesn't need to. The keeper raises a hand. A signal. 2 people emerge from the back room. You've seen them before. One carries a bucket, the other carries a stick. Neither is smiling. Punishments varied by brothel. Some favoured brute force, a slap, a kick, a brief reminder that physical pain costs nothing. Others preferred more theatrical methods, cold water dumped over the head, clothes confiscated, thrown into the street half-dressed. The goal was not just retribution, but reputation. If the brothel was known as a place where thieves were punished, fewer tried their luck. There were stories. One house branded cheaters with a hot iron shaped like a coin. Another made them clean chamber pots until their hands blistered. Some made offenders pay double next time, if there was a next time. For wealthier clients, the brothel was more subtle, a name written down, a quiet conversation with a servant, a bill sent to a spouse, a visit from someone who claimed to be a healer, but carried a large hammer instead. You watch now as the merchant is escorted outside, not with violence, but with firmness. His boots are taken. His coat is soaked in something that smells like vinegar and onion. A chalk symbol is drawn on his back. People in the street will see it. They'll know. He'll deny everything. No one will believe him. Back inside, the keeper sighs again. Coins are still missing, but justice at least has been served. The worker returns to her corner. She's already calculating how many clients she'll need today to make up for the loss. She does not complain. She's done this before. This is how the brothel maintains order, not with kindness, not with mercy, but with consequences. Every transaction must end cleanly. Every client must pay. Every worker must be protected, at least to the extent that the business requires. You return to your room. Your coin pouch is still full, for now. You make a mental note to double check it before you leave, because in this building you pay, one way or another. The sun is rising again. Pale and reluctant, it creeps through the cracks in the shutters and paints everything in a greyish hue that makes even the clean spots look tired. The floor creaks. The walls groan. And somewhere, a rooster crows with the kind of energy that suggests it has never spent a night in a brothel. You sit up slowly. Your head throbs. Your back aches. Your mouth tastes like old wood and unresolved guilt. This is the morning after. You've survived. Technically. The building is quieter now. The storm has passed. The candles have burned down to puddles. The wine has run out. The singing has stopped. You can hear the faint rustle of straw being replaced, linens being shaken out, someone sweeping something into a bucket with more enthusiasm than accuracy. This is what survival looks like. Not triumphant, not clean, just still breathing. Some people don't make it through the night. They drink too much. They fall downstairs. They offend the wrong person. They contract something that blooms too quickly to ignore. But you're not one of them. At least not today. The brothel does not celebrate survivors. It does not hand out medals or hang garlands around your neck. It simply hands you your boots, nods at the door, and reminds you with silence that your time here is done. For now. You rise and take stock. Your coin pouch is lighter. Your skin is stickier. Your clothes smell like smoke, vinegar, and someone else's decisions. You've gained nothing. You've lost nothing. But something inside you feels a little looser. A little less sure. Breakfast is being prepared. The pot on the hearth bubbles faintly. Someone mutters about salt. Someone else mutters about the rats. The same stew is served again, made from the same leftovers, stirred with the same wooden spoon that has outlived 3 owners and 1 fire. You decline the bowl, not because you are full, but because you're not sure your stomach is ready for something that jiggles when you poke it. The workers are already back in motion. The day has started. There is no recovery period, no sleep-in hours, just new clients, new chores, new stains to scrub from the walls before the next noble shows up pretending not to recognize anyone. You watch them for a moment. The way they move. The way they carry themselves like nothing happened. Like everything that happened last night was just another shift. Another tally on the board. Another weight to carry that no one will count. And maybe that's what makes this place so heavy. The silence after. The way it forgets you the second you leave. There are no goodbyes, no nods, no glances back. You walk through the common room like a ghost, past the same table, past the same bowl of half-eaten bread, past the cat that now occupies the best chair in the building. You reach the door. The street beyond is wet. Cobblestones slick with morning dew and spilled ale. People are already out. Bakers shouting, carters grumbling. Someone chasing a chicken that absolutely does not want to be caught. You step outside and inhale. The air is different, not clean exactly, but colder, fresher. It smells like manure and new bread, and the promise that your day might get marginally worse if you let it. You walk. Your feet hurt. Your stomach growls. Your mind replays the night in fragments. The laughter, the shouting, the candle that leaned too far, the client who forgot his own name, the girl with the string around her wrist, and all of it wrapped in the knowledge that the brothel is still there, behind you, resetting itself, preparing for the next wave of regrets. You survived. You shouldn't have, but you did. And now you know something you didn't know yesterday. You know what it's like inside, what it sounds like, what it smells like, what it costs. And that is not knowledge that ever really leaves you. It sticks, like wax in the cracks of your shoes, like straw in the hem of your cloak, like a whisper you thought you imagined. You keep walking, and for the first time in hours you realize your hands are shaking, not from fear, Not from cold, but from memory. Because now you understand what it means to survive a night in a medieval brothel, and why most people never come back. You've survived the meat pies, the bathwater politics, the mysterious ointments, the airborne syphilis, and at least 3 near-death experiences involving pickled onions. You now know things you can never unknow, and frankly neither can your pillow. So the next time someone tries to romanticize the medieval era with talk of chivalry, candlelight, and simpler times, just smile gently and remember what a brothel mattress actually felt like. Rougher than a monk's confession, and twice as sweaty. If you've made it this far without dry heaving or cancelling your medieval dinner theatre reservations, I salute you. You're braver than most historians and at least 60% of the clergy. If this story helped you fall asleep, then congratulations. You're now resting peacefully, with images of medieval ointment smugglers and aggressive goat rugs gently bouncing around your subconscious. If you're still awake, well, maybe consider subscribing. There are plenty more weird, wonderful, historically accurate nightmares waiting just around the corner. From Viking winter survival camps to the culinary crimes of ancient Rome, we've got you covered. Until next time, sleep tight, and maybe avoid any mysterious elixirs before bed. Just trust me.